Hello, I'm Nicola Palfrey. I'm a clinical psychologist and director of the Australian Child and Adolescent Trauma, Loss and Grief Network at the Australian National University. Today we're going to go through just some basic strategies to give some information based on evidence and research that we've collated over the last 2 years in developing our Community Trauma Toolkit. We'll take you through some of the key points and information and resources for educators and other staff working with children and families over the next few weeks. So first of all, I'd like to acknowledge the land on which we meet on today and pay respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, their ancestry, the elders, past, present and emerging from the different First Nations across this country. We're filming this in Canberra on the land of the Ngunnawal people, and we acknowledge the importance of connection to land, culture, spirituality, ancestry, family and community for the wellbeing of all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children, families and communities. So before we start today, whenever we're talking about experiences that people have gone through, such as the terrible fires and other storms and dust and smoke over the summer, we all need to be conscious of our own experiences that we bring into the room today. And I'd ask you all to be mindful of how you're travelling, if you're watching this alone or in a group. If you need to take a break, take care of yourself, look after yourself, then please do. Whenever we're talking about children and the impacts of frightening events, it can be distressing. So we're trying to offer practical strategies today, but also be very aware of taking care of yourself. And we'll talk a bit about that more as we go along today. So to give a little bit of context, so as I said, I work within the ANU Medical School and we're part of the partners delivering the National Workforce Centre for Child Mental Health. Emergingminds.com.au is where you can find all of our resources and information. We're a federally funded initiative by the Commonwealth Department of Health. And the reason we're doing this today is because one of the major projects that we've worked on over the last couple of years is the development of a Community Trauma Toolkit. So that's a resource that's freely available for everybody across Australia to access. There's specific resources for educators, but also families, first responders, GPs, allied health professionals and community leaders. And it was an amalgamation of the expertise across the country, so everyone from experts in the field, researchers, clinicians, and most importantly, children and families with a lived experience of natural disaster or other disasters. And so the wealth of that, bringing that knowledge together, we're drawing from today to try and give educators some support as they go back into the school year in 2020. There's a lot of information flying around at the moment, which is great, but it can be hard to navigate. So just to give you some orientation about who we are and where we fit with other programs, we're the sister program to BU, which is the Mental Health in Schools initiative that a lot of you will be aware of, which is a combination of the resources led by Beyond Blue and in partnership with Headspace and Early Childhood Australia. So we work really closely together. So a lot of the resources that we're talking about today are available both on the emergingminds.com.au website and also on the BU website. So we're sister programs working together to support the mental health and wellbeing of children and young people across Australia. So let's get into it. As I said, a lot of what we're going through today are some key messages to support educators as children and families return to school in the new year. There will be a huge variety of experiences that families have gone through in the summer, some of them extremely traumatic, others might be overwhelming, others might have been a little bit removed, depending on where they're located and their proximity to all of the events that have gone on. Most of what we're talking about today is common sense, so please don't think that we are telling you what to do. We really are here to reassure what we know is already the excellent practice that happens in all education settings across Australia. And we found in doing this work in the past that sometimes it's just reassuring to have some confirmation that what you thought was the right approach is the right approach. So it's not going to be a lot of new information today, I don't think, but it's more trying to provide a common framework or a common understanding of what is the best evidence-based approach, particularly in term one this year as kids are getting back into school, rather than in the longer term. And we can talk about towards the end what else might be helpful to support educators as we move through the school year. So the first and most important message, I think, is that most children cope and recover well from a disaster with the right supports. What we're seeing at the moment is what we would classify as the immediate aftermath of a disaster. It's still threat ongoing, there's still storms going on, there seems to be a new thing every day. So we're really in the immediate aftermath of a disaster. And educators in their role with children and families are uniquely placed to support families. But when we're talking about the immediate aftermath, we're really keen to talk about the sorts of key supports that can occur, because there's often a lot of anxiety amongst parents about how to best support their children, whether or not they need therapy straight away, should they be talking to them, and those sorts of things. So we're going to cover some of those practical things to start off with. So educators working with children, this list is really a list of what educators do every year when they start a new school year. It's about getting into the classroom, welcoming children and families in, setting up and establishing routines, which is the order of business every year, but will be particularly important for kids that have had a difficult time over summer. There's a real reassurance and comfort in routines for children. We know in talking to families who've experienced bushfires in the past, educators, when we worked with the families from Strathewen, the educators talked there about that once they came back into their makeshift school only a couple of days after those awful fires, the kids wanted all the things they previously didn't want. They wanted tests, they wanted school uniforms, they wanted readers. So very reassuring for children to know that there's common expectations and rules and routines, because over summer they will have experienced a lot of situations potentially where there was a whole lot of things that were out of their control and felt very frightening. Relationships, of course, again, are central to all schools, but establishing new and developing established relationships will be really important for children. They'll be looking forward to seeing their friends again and seeing how they're travelling. Also, perhaps talking about something other than what's been going on over the summer will be a light relief for a lot of kids. We need to have our boundaries and established expectations in place in schools, but also understanding that there needs to be a little bit of flexibility. So boundaries that are clear, but also recognising that some kids, particularly those that might be have been more directly impacted or intensely impacted over the summer, may struggle with some of the things that they could do even at the end of last year. They might struggle with concentration or with sitting still or with their emotions and so forth. But the boundaries are still important, with compassion, of course. We'll talk more about this as we go along, but providing children with opportunities, if they wish to talk about their experiences over the summer of the fires, but some containment around that so it's not necessarily dominating all day, every day. Kids need experiences of other stories or other experiences of play to get them through. Younger children may benefit from different creative opportunities. In fact, all children do well to be able to express themselves through different means, through art or music or dance, those sorts of things. Not everyone's a big talker. Some of the practical things around preparing children, giving them additional notice if there's changes to routines. I know that kids coming back will be perhaps vigilant around storms or events coming along if the smoke comes back, for example, so talking to children about that, giving them accurate information. Schools also have to run drills every semester, I think, so if they're coming up, lots of preparation in the lead up to it so kids are aware of what's going on and can prepare. Making an effort to increase or at least make sure it's central to the curriculum social and emotional wellbeing skills. So each class every day may benefit from some period of time where we're either expressly teaching social and emotional wellbeing through teaching of namings of feelings or expressing of feelings, mindfulness, circle time, checking with each other, relaxation strategies, those sorts of things will be key as well. The final thing, and we'll talk a lot about this towards the end of the presentation, is self-care for educators in the system. So educators are members of the community, of course. They're often parents themselves or grandparents, aunties, uncles. They have children in their care in their private lives as well as at work. They may have experienced significant distress themselves over the summer, so it's really important that individuals but also the school systems ensure there's adequate support for educators for them to be able to provide the support that children need. Okay, so we're going to run through fairly briefly the impacts of disaster on children. This is a kind of generalised information around any type of disaster or overwhelming event. We're not going to go through it in a huge amount of detail. All of these slides, but also additional resources with loads and loads of information on this is available freely. So we will go through it just to kind of cover it off in some detail today, but please be aware that all of this information is thoroughly available. One of the things that can occur in terms of children trying to make sense of disaster or families struggling with how people are reacting after a disaster is due to the perceptions of threat that differ between children and their parents, or children and adults. So adults have a kind of hierarchy of concern around loss of life, obviously, loss of property, but also concerns around income, finances and those sorts of things, whereas children, developmentally appropriately, are more egocentric. So they're concerned around harm to themselves or their loved ones, separation from their parents, loss of their teddies, loss of their pets, those sorts of things. And so this seems very sensible, but can also lead to conflict in a way. If a parent is struggling with how am I going to put dinner on the table, how am I going to get my business to recover, and the small child is unconsolably crying about the loss of Sooty, their favourite teddy, it can seem very insignificant. But I think just holding in mind that's how children think and what their version of events is and what concerns them is something to keep in mind. If we think about children's trauma reactions, like any reaction to good news or bad, every child will be different. They depend on a whole variation of factors, according to the child's age, according to what has happened previously for the child, their support systems, their exposure. As we said, some children will have had lived around smoke over the summer but not been near the fires, or they've seen frightening news or been concerned about loved ones far away, all the way up to children who have lost their homes. So the size and impact of their exposure to the disaster will be one of the key things that determines how they're responding, but also the level of natural supports. The parent-child relationship, the strength of the attachment and the connections within that broader community will be really important. That's why I think the return to school will be fantastic for a lot of children, because they'll get to go and check in with other adult connections that they have within the school, with their teachers, with the front office lady that they love, the principal or so forth, so other adults that can support that child, because their parents or direct family may have been pretty busy and inundated over the last couple of months. The final point is, which I'm sure you're all aware, is there's still a common misperception that children could be too little to be impacted by any adverse experience, but unfortunately we know that's not true. Even babies can be impacted by being around the stressful environments, the tension in the household, and they will become more reactive as well if they pick up on the sense that mum and dad are not okay, or if there's a very tense feeling in the household, which there was for lots of us over the summer as we were concerned about people, that you really can't be too little to be impacted. But the nice thing is that all children need the same kind of response, just age appropriate, of comfort, reassurance, connection with those around them. The reactions that children experience are across the spectrum. Again, I apologise for the slide, but it's just to cover, I suppose, the comprehensive nature. It can impact children across all of these domains, across their mood, across their behaviour, across how they're responding to things, their capacity to concentrate, as I mentioned before, and how they can act over time. But a lot of what we see in these first weeks after a disaster is a normal response to a really frightening event, an overwhelming event. Just a summer, no one's coming back refreshed, I don't think, this year. So kids are going to be fatigued, teachers are going to be fatigued, or educators within the system are going to have had a summer perhaps unlike they've ever had before. So it's just a reminder that we're going to see a lot of these perhaps behaviours or outbursts of grief or sadness, distress, but they will settle. It's really important to know that we would expect over the coming weeks, over term one, for example, that a lot of kids who may be a bit bumpy to start off with really start to return to what they could previously achieve. They feel more settled, they're getting into the routine, they're connecting with friends. We're going to keep an eye on kids over this time, but we would expect the majority of children to recover well. In terms of loss and grief in children can be anything, as I mentioned before, from the loss of a favourite teddy, obviously up to some children who may have lost family members, which is extraordinarily significant for a young child or a child of any age. The loss or grief of displacement, of being out of home, of losing possessions, as I said, of losing the opportunities to do what they thought they could do over the holiday. All of these varying degrees of loss children experience in different ways. So they may express it outwardly, saying that they're sad, they might be angry about that, the unfairness of it all, and all of those are legitimate emotions. Most children that will pass over time, again with the right supports. Children who have had significant loss, however, are at risk of complicated grief. So that's something that we won't go into a lot today, but something that we could talk a bit more further down the track if over the next 4 to 6 months or so forth that children are really struggling a lot still with their grief, then that's when we might look at getting them some additional supports. Talked a little bit about this, again, not surprisingly, the things that can impact children's recovery from impacts of disaster such as a bushfire are all three things: what's happened before, what happened during the event, and what has happened after it. So children that have had previous experiences of trauma and adversity, perhaps they have had experiences of living with family violence, or they're living in out-of-home care settings, or they've had significant difficulties in the past, then they have already got a threshold of trauma exposure which makes them more vulnerable. It might tip them over the edge in terms of feeling quite distressed or having more difficulty resuming their normal behaviour and capacity. I mentioned this before, what happened during the event, so level of exposure, threat to the child, how they experienced that. Did they feel, even though it was frightening, that the parents or the adults around them or the fireys had it all under control, or did they feel very much like they had no idea what was going on? And then obviously what's happened since. Have things returned to normal? Are they displaced? How are the adults around them responding? So there's a lot of variables that we would take into consideration, and children within the same family aren't necessarily going to be responding in the same way because they all come with their own development, their own temperament, their own experiences and so forth. Okay, so if we go through again, just briefly, some of the ages and stages of trauma responses. Obviously, the way children respond to frightening events is influenced by where they're at developmentally. Can they talk? Can they communicate their distress? What capacity do they have for doing that? What support do they have to do it? So we'll go through these just briefly. We've got some short videos to give you a break from me talking at you for a while, just to run through some of the overall developmental impacts that can happen. Children under the age of 4 can be impacted by these events, as I previously mentioned. They can in fact be particularly vulnerable because of their complete reliance on adults around them for safety and security. Their brain development, which is obviously going gangbusters at this time, is very sensitive to stress around them, levels of cortisol in the atmosphere, levels of cortisol elevated in the children related to the stress going on around them. So if we have a look now, we've just got a couple of minute videos taking us through the different age groups.
Psychological reactions to trauma amongst infants 0 to 24 months include heightened arousal, changes in appetite, regression in developmental skills, decrease in vocalizations, behavioural changes, excessive clinginess to primary caregiver, clinginess to anyone, decrease in responsiveness, inconsolable crying, and feeling alarmed by reminders of the event.
If we think about the next age group now, toddlers to preschoolers, they're moving up in terms of their development, obviously, and their capacity to be verbal and discuss what's going on, or have some understanding of what's going on, but they don't have understanding necessarily about the permanency of change or loss. They may be very confused about what caused the event, and we may underestimate sometimes the benefits of having a discussion with little ones about what has happened or what's going to happen next, because if we don't do that, they will come to their own assumptions, and sometimes that leaves them feeling concerned about their role in it, which sounds a bit odd, but the egocentricity of kids, where they can take the credit for good things, often means they can take the blame for bad things. So we want to give them some information about what is going on and what has happened and why it's happened and so forth. They may be clingy, they may be distressed at bedtime or wanting to chat at bedtime and so forth. But we've got another short video that takes you through some of those overarching developmental changes that you might see temporarily.
Psychological reactions to trauma amongst children aged 2 to 4 years include heightened arousal, changes in appetite, regression in developmental skills, loss of confidence, sad and withdrawn appearance, increased physical complaints, behavioural changes, difficulty in concentrating and paying attention, aggression and angry behaviours towards themselves or others, and reliving the trauma.
So as we move into primary school age children, we can see as their development increases and their capacity to understand what's going on, also their capacity to worry and be concerned about what has happened, why it has happened, if it's going to happen again may increase. One of the things to be aware of is often children will keep these fears to themselves after a disaster. And that's because they're old enough to pick up on, even though it doesn't always seem it at other times, to pick up on when adults are stressed. Adults are feeling overwhelmed, they might see their parents distressed in a way they've never seen before. They've also sometimes had an experience that has quite rocked them in that prior to this disaster they'd had a notion that mum and dad could keep them safe from everything, that mum and dad were superheroes or that they were able to protect them from any of the bad things out there in the world. And this may have shattered that for kids, and that can be quite a shock. And so having conversations with children around how they're feeling, what might they be concerned about, in an age-appropriate and contained way can be really helpful, because otherwise kids may well keep it to themselves, really internalise those concerns and feelings. There'll be a lot of chatter, I would imagine, back at school around the causes of the fires, around climate change, around who's to blame, all of those sorts of things. And I think educators are perfectly positioned and have the perfect skills to move those conversations, validate those concerns and move them into constructive conversations about what should happen, and talk about advocacy and what young kids can do, and Greta Thunberg, all those sorts of more empowering steps for children can be really helpful. It can be really helpful to help move kids from a sense of helplessness or hopelessness to feeling like they can do something. And that's one of the areas where we want to help kids move through their experiences, so they can chat about what they've been through, but also move into a phase where they're starting to feel like that there's more hope in the future, or there's some influence that they can have in terms of how to move forward and how to make the country and their community and so forth more resilient. So if we have a look at the overall developmental milestones for this age group, you can see that they're very similar to the younger age groups, and they extend into adolescence as well. But as we're getting to the tween years and into adolescence, some of that acting out behaviour and sense of hopelessness we want to keep an eye on in the months that come.
Psychological reactions to trauma amongst children 5 to 12 years include intrusions, avoidance, changes in arousal and reactivity, changes in mood and thinking, emotional distress, behaviour changes, decline in school performance, physical complaints, withdrawal from family and friends, changes in appetite, and anxiety and fear for their own and others' safety.
So just to wrap up that short section on some of children's responses to trauma, what we can expect over term 1 this year is that after perhaps a wobbly start for a number of kids who may have difficulty with some separations from parents or settling in class or concentrating, that things start to return back to how they were functioning at the end of last year, for example. So the majority of kids will recover really well. As we get to the end of this term, there may be a number of children, a small minority who might need some additional support, and then over the longer term we would expect somewhere, depending on exposure, between 5 to 15% of children over the longer term may benefit from some sort of therapeutic intervention, but we really wouldn't want to think about necessarily diagnosing or pathologising children's behaviour in this first term, because we really need to allow for natural recovery to occur. Okay, so if we talk about what can we do in the education settings to support children, the main approach that we would advocate is based on the principles of trauma-informed care or trauma-informed education. And I know a lot of you will have done various programs or social emotional wellbeing programs that are based on the premise of trauma-informed care. It really has excellent evidence base, both internationally and emerging here in Australia, that it benefits all children, not just children who've experienced adversity. And after this summer, that we know that the majority of children have had some exposure to a frightening event, either vicariously through media or through direct exposure. So we're going to talk about a trauma-informed approach in the classroom, what that might look like in terms of behaviour management strategies, engagement strategies, and also, importantly, care for educators, because it's a whole systems approach. You can't just provide care, trauma-sensitive care for children, you need to provide it across the whole school, and that includes everybody who works within the school or educational setting, because if the adults aren't okay, then the kids aren't going to be okay. So the first thing we're going to talk about today is a concept that a lot of people are familiar with, psychological first aid, which is an international evidence-based approach to managing distress in critical incident situations. So all of the volunteers that would have been manning the emergency relief centres over the summer and continue to do so are trained in psychological first aid. We have got an adaptation of psychological first aid for children, which again is evidence-based and really a very simple and straightforward approach to managing children in the immediate circumstance of a disaster or critical incident, for example, in a school, but also in the days and weeks afterwards. And so this approach is still sound if you are having an incident in the school, or if there is something that really evokes a reaction in the first days and weeks back at school where people are feeling very distressed or overwhelmed. And it's a simple approach around really protecting a child, making sure they're safe, away from any sights or sounds of danger, but also then moving into connection, reassurance and safety for them in terms of physical, emotional, psychological safety. So it's a very contained approach, and it's not asking anybody to go in and step in as a counsellor. It's actively not counselling. It's containing, reassuring and providing the information and support that a child needs in order in that moment to feel contained and supported. So when we talk about the role of the educator post-disaster, it really is, as we mentioned right up front, going back to the principles and pedagogy that teachers are used to and educators are used to, which is around how to provide structure, setting, routine, emotional connection for students as they come back into the new school year. So continue being a good educator, look for opportunities to support children in relationships, look for opportunities for them to creatively express themselves, not just necessarily about the disaster, about anything, give time for play and really provide that structure and connection with other adults that will support them in the long term. Now I want to share with you one of the brief videos that's contained in the Community Trauma Toolkit. It's by Ruth Wraith, who's a psychotherapist with many decades experience supporting schools, individuals, families and communities following disaster. Ruth Wraith has the capacity to talk on a whole wide range of these topics, and so I'd encourage you, if you're interested in more support and information, there's a number of videos with Ruth talking in the toolkit that are freely accessible. There's also a suite of other videos, everything up from a 1 or 2 minute video around children's responses in the immediate, short and long term after a disaster. Also, we have some fantastic videos that we shot with the Queensland Centre for Infant and Perinatal Mental Health, so I really encourage you to check out their resources. They're the group that have developed the Birdie's Tree storybooks and games, which again are freely available and are designed specifically to support children and families following disaster. So all of those videos around the use of play, the use of storytelling, how early childhood curriculum and disaster are all as part of the toolkit. So I encourage you to have a look at that after today and see if any of that is useful for you. We have a long form film as well, which is a half-an-hour film with the community of Strathewen talking about their 10-year road to recovery, which is a fantastic resource. I think that may be more useful in a few weeks or months' time. It could be a bit overwhelming at this stage to think about that really long-term recovery, so that's why today we're focusing on the immediate aftermath. But in this video we're about to show, Ruth is talking about the importance of re-establishing routines in the educational settings, and it helps just to step through some of those benefits and how that can work. So we'll take a look at that now.
For school-age children, one of the most important factors is for, as soon as is practically possible, for the school routine to be re-established. Now, that will be getting up, going to school, etc. It may not necessarily be rigidly in your school uniform with all your books and turning up at 9 o'clock, but to have that opportunity to re-engage with a normal routine. For children, that will also mean they are now able to come back with their friends. That then means there's the opportunity to play. It also means that there's the opportunity for children to be able to express a range of emotional responses, to talk about their experiences with their friends. That then means that there needs to be a lot of support provided for school teachers, for school staff, because that system itself will have been impacted, will be dealing with a whole range of demands and stresses. Other things the community can do is, as soon as is practical for children, is to get the normal extracurricular type activities happening. So cricket starting up again, dancing happening again, whatever it is that functions within the community to support that community to function. Thinking of a disaster when, in fact, the world has turned into a semblance, to a greater or lesser extent, of chaos, which is very frightening. To have, as I was talking a moment ago about routine, re-established is very important. So parents do need, as much as is possible, to hold to the basic routines and rules that are required for the child's well-being. Lots of lollies and sitting up watching television till midnight is not actually helpful for the child's health and well-being. However, because the children themselves are maybe having a whole range of very different physical and psychological reactions, there needs to be a lot of understanding on behalf of parents as well as everybody else. So there needs to be flexibility around applying the basic rules and regulations. So if a child is having difficulty concentrating or processing too much information because they're still in a state of shock, or their mind is busy with what has happened, or because they're tired because they're having nightmares and not sleeping well. That needs to be understood.
So just to reiterate, we've discussed a lot of these points already, but I just wanted to go through some quite practical and pragmatic strategies for in the classroom or educational settings across the age groups. We've actually grouped together 2 to 12-year-olds here because whilst obviously developmentally they're very different across those age groups, the overarching strategies are very similar. So we've talked about re-establishing routines, we've talked about clear expectations and so forth. I think one of the real balancing acts that educators will have is between establishing expectations of behaviour and how we speak with each other or how we relate in a classroom or in a school, but also understanding that that is going to be tricky to manage for some children in the short term. There'll be some children who will have real trouble staying away from their parents all day. I know in talking with the educators at Strathew, they spoke about children after the Black Saturday fires. They couldn't get through a school day without calling home sometimes. They just needed to check in with mum if she was okay. So having the flexibility to understand that sometimes children just need that reassurance or touchstones to get through, particularly those who may have been most impacted, is really helpful to keep in mind. So the other thing is children will connect with those that they know best. And when we're talking about additional resourcing within schools, it can be really helpful to have additional supports, but as much as possible, children will want to connect with those that they know. And that places a really big burden on those educators within those systems. So I'd encourage all schools and executives to have a look across the educational settings to make sure that there's resources as much as possible in place to provide secondary support, supervision and guidance for those people on the front line that are going to be doing a lot of the heavy lifting emotionally with some of those families and children that are needing additional support. One of the things that we can be tempted to do, and families will talk about this, and I know educators will get a lot of questions from families about how to best manage children and their behaviours or their displacement and so forth, is really around that maintaining of expectations around behaviour or family values, whatever it may be. There's going to have to be flexibility. There's not necessarily going to be dinner around the table for people every night at the same time. However, children like routine. They find it very comforting. We've talked a lot about this, but also children feel much more safe and secure when their expectations are set. And we talk a little bit about this in the sense of often when children get a relief teacher, and this may be the case in some of the settings as people are getting up and running, kids will often test the boundaries of that teacher just so they know where it will go to. And that's part of safety and security. They're not necessarily conscious of that, but what they're doing is trying to establish how far will you let me go? What can we get away with? Which can look like a whole lot of fun, but actually for children that are feeling not okay, that's when they're really trying to sense whether or not the adults are in charge and have got the boundaries in place. That means that they know what they can and cannot do, and that is what can calm them down and allow them to feel safe and secure and ready to learn in those settings. The use of relaxation spaces or sensory spaces in the classroom, I know a lot of educators have those set up already, but perhaps re-looking at those and communicating that kids can use them with children that are having particular difficulty perhaps getting through the school day without getting very distressed or frustrated or acting out in some way, working with them to develop a bit of a plan around how they can start to notice in their body if they're getting distressed or if they're getting upset or if they're getting angry. And over time, we know in the schools that we've worked with that can be extremely successful, particularly if it's developed with the kids. If we just impart a plan on somebody else, it doesn't necessarily work that well. Even with adults, if somebody tells us just to relax, that doesn't usually work either. So working with children around things that they think that they could do. Now that might be quiet time in the corner, it might be therapy, it might be drawing for a little while. Some kids will need to bring themselves down, other kids need to bring themselves up to kind of express some of that internal agitation that's going on. So some of the schools we've worked with have a space. Deep Blue is it's called in one of the schools we worked with, and when children can go there, if they're not managing that well in class, they go there. It's not a punishment, but it's a space where they can go to, and they're moving through, they're coming in and checking in where they are emotionally. They could have a traffic light system of green, orange and red, and depending on the age of the child, the different feelings associated with that. But then children can choose the activity they want to do. So some might want to withdraw into themselves and do something very rhythmic or slow or quiet, whereas other kids might want to jump on the exercise bike and kind of pedal it out for a little while. So thinking about, are we offering a range of strategies for regulation for kids, and are we teaching them how to utilise them? Because when we teach them how to do it and they see the capacity to be able to bring themselves back down from red to orange, for example, or to get in before they get too agitated or frustrated, it's really building their capacity for self-regulation and their sense of competence in themselves. And they're the skills that we want to see in all children develop over time. And we need to teach them as explicitly as we teach other skills around reading and writing and so forth. So we've mentioned this a little bit beforehand, anticipating difficult times ahead. So the school calendar is packed, and there is sometimes little choice around what educators and administrators have to do within the school term and year. So having a look at that with a fresh eye around what might be difficult for some children. Will camp be viable for kids this year? Will excursions trigger some anxiety in people, particularly if they're going into zones that have been burnt out, for example? So having a think around how you manage that. As I mentioned before, drills or lockdowns, schools have to do these things, but when they happen and how they happen, as much notice as possible, provision of support for kids who might find it particularly difficult. All of these things educators will have in mind, but it's just a timely reminder to think about this as we're planning for the term ahead. Focusing on strengths, again, core work of educators, but utilising additional opportunities or opportunities wherever we can to look at stories of strength within the classroom setting or within the school setting, the community setting. I think one of the most loved quotes around when we'd seen events in the past, say man-made disasters or terrorism events, was that lovely quote which somebody said, look at all the people helping. When children are struggling with why somebody would do something so horrific to hurt other people, that notion of look at all the people that are stepping in to assist other people. And I think that notion of moving, not denying what has happened, but moving towards strengths and capacity and community togetherness is a really important thing, and looking at opportunities for that. Again, in talking with Jane and Di from Strathern Primary School, they talked about an excursion that they had a few months after the fires where they were able to get out of the area around them and go somewhere green for a day. And they said it was one of the first times they saw the children really relax and just run free and play and be kids again. So, and they had a lot of offers from different interested parties, community members or people wanting to help. And so they said that they had a program selected very carefully where they had, I think it was fortnightly events for the children. It might be just small events or people visiting, but they wanted a sense of optimism, something to look forward to that was not too much for people to manage, but also importantly for them, the families were very keen to be involved in the school. So looking at opportunities for that community coming together and spending some time together, because the kids may not like being separated from parents, but also there's going to be a lot of parents who are anxious at being separated from their children. So looking to support that and embrace that in a contained way that can work within the school calendar can be helpful. Talking to kids about natural disaster, just before I go on to that, I just want to mention one other thing that we haven't gone into, and that's extracurricular activities. Ruth mentions it in the video, but really important and helpful for kids. As soon as it's viable that they get back into their normal routines. If they tend to go to the park and run around with the dog on a Monday afternoon, or if they have sporting training during the week, or they usually go to dance or swimming lessons, those sorts of things, as much as possible, are really good for kids getting back into that routine, which I keep going on about, but also opportunities for fun, for feeling accomplished, for achieving new things. And so again, looking at those as much as possible. And I think one of the things that we can encourage children and families to do as well is accept help with some of those things. We're not very good at accepting help a lot of the time, where there's always someone else we can point to that needs more help. But if you're a community member that's looking to support other people in the community or looking to support children and families, some of those things, opportunities for connection, to give mum and dad a break. It might be offering to take the kids a couple of houses down to come to your house and do some planting, put some new plants in and teach them a little bit about gardening, or bake some afternoon treats. Or you might live interstate. You might offer to call your nephew once a week and have a chat about the footy scores. Just some things to offer other connections for the adults that have got a lot of rebuilding or a lot of recovery to do. Other adults that may be able to provide that support and connection for kids can be really helpful. It's not necessarily all about turning up on their front doorstep or sending all your discarded clothes and so forth, but those offers of providing connection and support for children can be really, really helpful. Okay, so talking to children about natural disasters, there's no absolute right or wrong way to do this. I think in these first weeks back at school, it's really going to be a balancing act between recognising that children are going to want to talk about what they've been through, again, as they would after any summer holidays. There's normal routines around what did you do over the holidays will still be there, but really being sensitive to the impact of that, not only on the other kids in the educational settings, but also to the educators themselves and staff. So having some capacity to share, support, but also contain those conversations. And kids are naturally very good at this. I think we can be quite fearful of people oversharing or sharing distressing details that might upset other kids. Somebody might be retelling a story thinking it was quite exciting, and the other child next to them might have experienced it as very overwhelming. So educators are well placed to moderate those conversations and set rules around what we share, but also to provide the opportunity to do it, but then also to move on. And so that might be a certain time each day or over a period over the first few weeks, which educators will need to monitor about how that is going and whether or not they think it's taking over too much or not. But kids will often form their own natural supports in terms of keeping an eye on their friends in the class, letting educators know if they feel somebody is not travelling so well. So I think those explicit conversations around, we're going to talk about our experiences here and then we're going to move on to the next activity, but also that in this setting, in this classroom, in this school, in this after-school setting, we look after each other, we let each other know if we're not doing okay, and setting those values around care and consideration for each other, which, again, are done as par for the course, are really important as we get into this managing of people wanting to be able to share their stories but looking after each other as well. One of the things as kids get older, as I said before, they may want to talk about their experiences, but they also may have some very strong and valid views about what they think has happened, how well it was managed, whether it should have happened the way it happened, what the politicians have done, what we should be doing about climate change. And again, as I said, there's key strategies or many ideas that you could pick up on in that can link in with the curriculum. There's actually a whole organisation, the Australian Institute of Disaster Resilience, have got a whole suite of resources around talking about disaster, preparedness and recovery and linking with the Australian curriculum. So those opportunities could come up, perhaps not in those first weeks this year, but moving along about how constructively we can integrate kids' interest and fascination and passion about these events into constructive learning moving forward. One of the things that educators in all settings will be facing over the coming weeks is parents returning with their children who are concerned about their children, and understandably so. And as well as the normal separation and difficulty parents sometimes have with leaving the kids behind, that's probably going to be amplified this year. And so a lot of educators will be getting asked, what should I do? Should I put my child in therapy? And also potentially coping with a lot of disclosures, a lot of parents coming in and wanting to to really share what they've been through and how difficult that has been. And that's a very big burden for educators who have their own experiences over the summer. So having some preparation in place around how you manage that, whether or not there's the capacity to have an assembly with families early on in the term, just to talk about what the school is going to be doing and how they're going to be managing children, can be very containing. But I think the primary message that educators can give to families is to validate, of course, their concern, that they completely understand that they're maybe worried about their children and they're maybe distressed that their kids have been through things or seen things that they didn't want them to. That's completely understandable. Secondly, I think it's really important to have the conversation around natural recovery, that what we know for most kids following these events is that in time they will recover well with the right support, so that whilst we're concerned that they have seen or heard things or experienced things, that we would expect recovery. And so we would want to not jump into necessarily, certainly not diagnosing kids, and not even necessarily booking them all in for therapy at this stage. That is not what the research indicates is best practice. We want to give them a chance to get back to school, back to their friends, back to some routine, certainly keep an eye on them and keep checking in. So that ability to hear parents' concerns, can validate it, contain it to a certain extent, but also to give them some reassurance about that you're not just dismissing their concerns. So the language that we've got there up on the screen is just a containing conversation, maybe something around those lines of, I understand that you've got some concerns. Let's see how things go over the first couple of weeks. I'd expect things to settle, but if things aren't getting better at home or if they're getting worse, you let me know. I can always check in with you if anything is concerning at school, so let's keep communication open. And often that's enough to help parents feel heard and that they're being taken seriously, but we don't want to kind of fan the flames of distress or to jump into pathologising kids at this stage. We need to give them a chance to recover naturally before we intervene too heavily. Okay, so now as we move into the final section of this presentation, I really want to take some time to focus on support for educators. And this can often be one of those circumstances where it's a couple of slides at the end of a presentation. Don't forget about you, don't forget about your self-care and well-being. Now, we are going to say that, but I really want to emphasise that it's of critical importance. And I think it's one of the things that we talk about a lot, and we talk about in a big game sometimes across a whole lot of settings, education, health settings. We talk about how important it is for adults to look after themselves, but we're not very good at doing it. But there really is a significant and important impact if adults are able to prioritise themselves to a certain extent, because if we're not okay and we're overwhelmed, we really are not able to provide the best support for children. And some days you may not be able to do that. And so I think upfront having a kind of frank conversation within educational settings, within staff, that is absolutely to be understood. The variability in kids' impacts and children's experiences over summer is going to be mirrored by the adults in those settings. So having an explicit conversation around what educational settings are doing in terms of educator support and care, what things are in place for them to be able to step out if they need to talk to somebody. There's obviously traditional things in place like EAP counselling and so forth, but also educators need other opportunities for connection and support. So thinking about in your educational setting, what are we doing for that, and how are we offering support to ensure that the educators are able to feel contained, supported, because there's a big emotional burden of holding a class together, of holding a group of young children as they're telling their stories when you're going through your own responses and reactions. So having a think about, as an individual, what you can do to look after yourselves, but also I'd encourage all workplaces to have a conversation around how that is going to be managed in the workplaces to ensure all staff feel connected and feel that they have the capacity to be able to say if they're not okay and if they need some extra support. So this slide's around the importance of you, which is around exactly what we're talking about. For any educator to work with children, whether it be in the preparedness stage, and we're talking about preparedness here, we haven't so much beforehand, but actually Preparation is still quite important. We're still actually in the middle of the bushfire season, unfortunately. But so having a kind of preparedness psychologically as well as physically within schools around what the plans are for the term, including emergency plans and so forth, but also understanding how tricky that might be as we move into the term is really important. And we can't overstate it that if educators are feeling overwhelmed by this, then they're not the right ones to be delivering that to children at that point, and so we need to be flexible enough to provide that support for who needs to deliver what content to what children at what stage. Exactly as we've talked about with children, educators' experiences of stress will be based on all of the things we've just talked about with children, their previous experiences. Obviously, as adults, we come into this summer with our whole lifetime's experience of good things and adversity. So many may have been impacted by disaster in the past, whether that's natural disasters or other traumatic events, have our own experiences. It's very hard to get into adulthood without some experience of adversity or trauma. So all adults working with children are coming in with that. And then, as I said, our experiences over the summer will be wildly variable in terms of how much impact and exposure there has been. What we need to recognise is that impact is significant. Teaching, caring for children in early childhood settings, after school settings, is incredibly taxing work. It's emotionally taxing. There's increasing demands on educators' time inside a class, outside of class. We know that already, and so this is going to add an extra level of burden. And so if we're coming back to the new school year, a lot of people are not going to be having had a summer that refreshed and relaxed them and rejuvenated them, which they would have wished. So we've got to be aware that we're coming in at a certain level that perhaps puts us right on the edge of what we talk about, our window of tolerance, our capacity to remain flexible and open and adaptable and responsive is going to be squeezed a little bit as we come into this new school year. So we need to be able to think about checking in with ourselves. What do we need to look after ourselves, but also to make sure that educators in all settings feel supported to be able to communicate if they're feeling that they're really at the edge of their capacity to be the kind of educator they want to be and respond in the way they want to respond. Everybody has their own way of displaying when they're getting what we might call burnt out through secondary traumatic stress, vicarious trauma, burnout, compassion fatigue, whatever you want to call it. Everybody is open to that, particularly people in education settings, health settings, people that work a lot with people who've experienced trauma and adversity are very aware of it. In the health settings, we tend to have more structure in place and support. I've noticed in working with schools, there's a sense that educators just cope with it. There's not necessarily the formal requirements that they have supervision, say that psychologists or others have. But I think it's really important that we're aware of it, that we talk about it, that it is a normal response to overwhelm. And one of the main things is to understand and spend a little bit of time yourself working out, how do you know when you're at the edge? How do you know if you're at the edge of your window of tolerance, as I spoke about, or your capacity to be kind to yourself and others? So some people will withdraw, some people will get snappy, some people will distance themselves from interactions and kind of keep people at an arm's length. So spending a little bit of time, we're going to talk a bit about self-care and self-care plans, but I think this is really important as well, to have a bit of time honestly with yourself. Ask your loved ones, give them permission to be honest. How do you know when I'm not travelling okay? And perhaps give people permission. It might be your mum or your partner or your best friend to say, I've noticed this about you, or you're looking overwhelmed, you're sounding a bit fraught, those sorts of things. If you can give somebody a permission to give you maybe, I'm a concerned message, you have to kind of try and promise that you'll accept it in the manner that it's offered. It can be helpful just to keep on top of how we're travelling psychologically and emotionally through these times, because the sooner we get in, the easier it is to recover from that, to step away, to ask for some support, even if it's just perhaps a period off class, to have some quiet time. I know teachers hate being away and educators hate being away from their kids, particularly when they've had a tough time, but it is really important to try and manage that load and keep yourself and your well-being balanced at the same time. So self-care is a topic that often I think people talk about, as I said, but it's probably one of the topics that people can often roll their eyes at and think, well, sure, if I had the time, I would do that, but have you seen what my workload is like? And whilst I acknowledge all of that is true, I think it is critical at this time when you've got the experiences that have happened over the summer and the anticipatory stress of coming back into school. I think also the length of the fires and other adversity, storms, smoke, so forth that we've experienced over the summer is really, to use that word we've all heard, unprecedented. So I invite you to think about it with a bit of an open mind, if nothing else, because we're all coming back depleted, as I mentioned before. So if you think about how self-care might look for you, you want to look at it across the spectrum of events or ways that you could look after yourself. So we've got some tips for self-care there, which I think will be familiar to most people. It's about prioritising your needs, taking some time where you can. Also looking for your support networks and how you can integrate maybe connection with people outside of the education system or other friends or whatever it may be. Pleasurable activities, it might be taking the dog for a walk now that the smoke is cleared, or spending a little bit of time, downtime watching a favourite show once a week or whenever you can, but prioritising some time to switch off and look after yourself, maintain connections, healthy lifestyle, good sleep, all of those sorts of things that we're familiar with. But I really would encourage everybody to think about maybe doing a self-care plan. We've got resources for that, can show you an idea of a self-care plan that we've filled out just to give people an idea of that. But it's really maybe identifying one or two things that you could try and get into place. And sometimes it's helpful to track it. We don't necessarily notice if it's helping or not, but sometimes thinking about even a mood diary, or tracking how you're feeling over time. We all know, unfortunately, when we do the right thing, we often feel better, that when we do come back from that walk, we feel a little bit refreshed if we do go and sit in the sun for 10 minutes, if it's not too hot, not too cold, and just have a bit of quiet time, that we can actually feel ourselves feeling a little bit replenished. But I would encourage, as I said before, not leaving it to chance, having conversations early on in the school year around how educators and all of the teams working in educational settings are going to be looked after. If there's external support provided, I would encourage administrators to give educators choice about how that works, what it looks like. Deployment of additional resources is another thing that can really help. A lot of educators we've talked about in the recovery process get swamped down with administrative duties, whether it's handling donations or requests for information, or even the best, most generous offers of help still take up a lot of time, and it often takes educators away from what they want to be doing, which is being in the classroom with their kids. So thinking from administrators' point of view, thinking about how additional resources can be deployed perhaps to ease the administrative burden from educators who would rather be in with the kids, or vice versa, if we can swap those roles around, if educators might need a break off class for a little while. So I think up front this year, having conversations around what could be put in place to check in with staff as we progress through the term, in terms of that flexibility or capacity to be on or off class, or to be connected in, or to have extra resources deployed in the most useful way, rather than just imposed without consultation, can be really helpful. Okay, so to finish up with this session today, we've just got a recap of some of the key messages. These are the messages that actually exist throughout the resources we've developed as part of the Community Trauma Toolkit. So I'll run through them briefly because they're behind me, and also you'll have heard them today. Self-care for the adults supporting children is incredibly important, looking after your own well-being. And if you're not doing well, as the next kind of weeks and months progress, then I would really encourage you to chat to your supports within your networks, but also perhaps your GP is a great place to start if you're feeling like you are needing some additional support, that your sleep's not returning to normal, or you're feeling really that your mood is still quite impacted. Then do take those additional steps. We know, and we've reiterated, that children, even babies and infants, can be impacted by natural disasters and traumatic events. So we need to be on the lookout. I would say that we are concerned but not overly ready to jump in and diagnose kids at this point. We want to give them a chance to recover. They need compassion, they need support, they need the boundaries that we've talked about, with understanding that all behaviour is communication, and that if there's behaviours that are very disruptive, distressing, then that child is going to potentially need some additional support, not necessarily from a therapist at this stage, but from their trusted adults, from their educators in the system, to help them express how they're feeling and develop some strategies and tools, as we talked about, to be able to manage that in a way that's not so distressing for them or disruptive for their peers around them. We're going to expect most kids to recover well over the next term or so, that they will move on to their new normal, sometimes people like to call it, where they've integrated some of these experiences that they've had over the summer, that they might have had a bit of a bumpy road in terms of their development, but they're getting back on track with their concentration, their friendships, their relationships, and their capacity to separate, and all of those other developmental milestones. A small but significant majority of kids, depending on their pre-event exposure to traumatic events, for example, the intensity of the events that they've experienced over the summer and what has happened since, may need some additional support. So if we're entering mid-term, end of term one, and you have some children that you're working with that you're still quite concerned about, the adults in their life are concerned about, that they're really not recovering as you might hope, that they're really still having trouble with intrusive memories, sleep, separation, distress, those sorts of things, then again, GP is a really good place to start. And there's really excellent resources available, great treatment available, but we want to, as I said, probably at least give the first half of this term kids some capacity to kind of pick up and move forward, noting that this is for a later time, that a number of children may recover well initially and then stumble a little bit further down the track. So 4 or 6 months or even a year after the event is actually when sometimes we see children get a rise in their symptoms of their distress. So we need to keep an eye on kids over time. It's a real balancing act between not panicking in this first instance, but then also not just thinking it's all going to be behind us in a couple of months' time. One of the other messages is that children have agency and capacity, and we've seen that in the climate change debate and rallies over the last couple of years. And really one of the key agents for recovery and for children feeling that they have some autonomy and hope for the future is capacity for them to express their thoughts and feelings and ideas, and to do that in constructive ways that they feel like is being taken seriously by adults. So looking at ways that they can do that, to express their views, to ask questions. There's been some great examples in Australia, also in New Zealand, of children in upper primary. After the earthquakes in New Zealand, for example, there was a YouTube video series produced by kids talking and interviewing experts about earthquakes and what happened and why did this fall down and what are they doing to safeguard it in the future. And so giving children the capacity to ask the questions that they want answered, and for it to be taken seriously, and creative ways of doing that are some really good ideas for the longer term as well. And so finally, I think one of the key points, back to normality over the next couple of weeks. Explicit support for children to learn, name and express feelings, opportunities to discuss their experiences if they would like to, never force a child to talk about their experience, but also containment around that, and firm establishment of how we're going to share stories and how we're going to make sure everybody feels safe and able to engage in that if they wish to or do not wish to, will be really important over the coming weeks. Okay, so that wraps up the presentation for today. I hope you found it valuable. As I said, a lot of it will be extraordinarily familiar to all of you. We just wanted to provide a central source of information that is based on all of the work we've done over the last couple of years, talking to the experts in the field as well as those with the lived experience, so that there can be a common platform for conversations within educational settings to feel like they're confident moving forward. As I said, this is one resource that we shared today There's hundreds more, which we know can be incredibly overwhelming. So both the BU initiative and Emerging Minds have got summary resources for educators. BU have just released in the last day or so a kind of back to school resources kit, which the link is behind me there. We will also make available this presentation, obviously, but also any of the resources that it was based on for people to access. Everything is available freely online, as I mentioned, thanks to the Commonwealth Department of Health, who have funded both the Emerging Minds National Workforce Centre for Child Mental Health and the BU project. Finally, we have been developing this in consultation with our partners, but also with the Commonwealth Department of Education, and we're really interested to see if this sort of information would be helpful in the future. We were thinking perhaps similar sorts of information and resources, but a few months down the track as we're moving into that short-term recovery. So we would really appreciate any feedback that you would like to give us. There's a survey link behind us, a very short survey for us to try and see if what we gave you today was useful, if you would like more, and if so, what sorts of formats you would like it in. Also give us some idea of whether or not this is reaching communities. So if you have the opportunity, I would really appreciate you completing the survey. It should take you 3 minutes or so. It's only half a dozen or so questions, but it'll be really helpful in us knowing how we can meet the needs of educators across the country as they return to school this year. So thank you for your time and goodbye.